Committee-sponsored Democratic Gubernatorial Candidates Forum. I'm Dina Samfield, Chair of the Shirley Democratic Town Committee, and I want to say how proud I am that 14 Central Massachusetts Democratic Town Committees have worked together to make it possible for those of us in and around the 3rd Congressional District to submit for those of us sitting around the 3rd Congressional District to submit our questions to the candidates. Thank you, everybody who submitted your questions. And these candidates were willing to take the time on an icy February Saturday to answer them in this public forum. Thank you also to the Reuben Hoare Library and Littleton Community Television for your coverage. There is a mask mandate in Littleton for indoors, so please bear with us as we speak through our masks. And now I would like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, who will introduce the candidates. Kathleen O'Connor currently serves as the chair of the Air Democratic Town Committee and is the vice chair of the First Middlesex Democrats. She is a former vice chair of the Middlesex and Worcester Dems and has worked in nonprofits and as a congressional aide to former Congressman Marty Meehan. She has been a political activist since before she was old enough to vote and has served as both a campaign treasurer and chair for several candidates. She has made no decision yet as to whom she will be supporting in the gubernatorial primary. Thank you, Kathleen. I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Dina. Good afternoon. Prior to the start of the forum, the candidates participated in a coin toss to determine who would make opening remarks first. Danielle Allen was the winner of the coin toss and has opted to speak first. I will give a brief introduction of each candidate before they speak, and they will be given up to 5 minutes each to make their introductory remarks. At the conclusion of the speeches, we will begin with the questions submitted to us from voters from around the state on a variety of topics. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer the question, and we will alternate who answers first. Once both candidates have answered, the candidate who spoke first will be allowed 1 minute for a rejoinder, should they wish. At the conclusion of the questions, each candidate will be given a 5-minute closing statement, with Sonia Diaz speaking first. We remind our in-person attendees that masks must remain over your mouth and nose for the duration of the event, no exceptions. Speaking first today is Professor Danielle Allen. Professor Danielle Allen is a seasoned nonprofit leader, a democracy advocate, and a national voice on pandemic response, and a mom. Danielle's work to make the world better for young people became personal in 1995 when her younger cousin Michael was incarcerated in Southern California. Since losing him in 2009 to a combination of mass incarceration and gun violence, she has used every tool at her disposal to drive change. Danielle's fight has taken her from teaching college and leading a $60 million university division to driving change at the helm of major nonprofits, advocating for cannabis legalization, democracy reform, civic education, and now running for governor. Most recently, Danielle's leadership in rallying coalitions and building solutions resulted in the country's first roadmap to pandemic resilience. Her policies were adopted in federal legislation and a Biden executive order. Part of a wave of Black women running to make gubernatorial history in 2022, Danielle is working to reimagine the possible, knit our communities together as one Commonwealth, and help Massachusetts forge a path out of these hard times towards the green and healthy next generation democracy we all deserve.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and Dina, thank you for your extraordinary organization, and all of you who are here. It's great to see you. Good afternoon. It feels good to be in real space with real people, and it's nice to feel you in this room. This is such an important moment. Thank you for the introduction. I am Danielle Allen, running to be our next governor. My students call me Prof. Danielle, and I've been called all kinds of things. Dean and director, chairman of the board, but my favorite title is mom. And next best is just plain Danielle, so please feel free to call me that. I have traded in my day job to try to answer a call to service. This is not a time for business as usual. It's a time for bold and decisive action, and I am ready. As you've heard, life hasn't been about business as usual for me since 1995 when my cousin first went to prison, and then 2009 when we lost him. And something you all know about families when they have a loved one in dire straits is you pour all your energy and efforts just into tomorrow, trying to make sure that tomorrow they're doing okay. And so in 2009, when I lost my cousin, that was the point at which it became possible for me to take the energy that had been poured into him and his life and to pour it more generally into the change that we all need to lay a foundation for young people to have healthy lives and healthy futures. And I know I am not alone in feeling that this is not a time for business as usual. For every family that's lost loved ones in the opioid epidemic, that's been true for years. And the pandemic has driven home from all over our Commonwealth, Littleton, Acton, Shirley, the whole range of our Commonwealth, that it's just not a time for business as usual for anyone. For me, in dark times, what's always brought me light and hope is being part of a big team, a team of guts and grit and heart and hustle. And since you've all showed up here today, I know you're all part of a team like that too, leading a path out of these dark times for your community. Where do we deserve to get? We all deserve to get to a green and healthy next generation democracy. But how do we get there? We've got to commit. It starts from commitment. We've got to commit to a roof over every head. We've got to commit to electrifying our damn trains and building a Commonwealth-wide rail system to drive that transition to a 100% renewable energy economy by 2040. We've got to commit to decriminalizing addiction. We've got to get people help, not handcuffs. That means building out substance use disorder treatment and resources and recovery resources and supportive housing. But it also means reclassifying simple use and possession of controlled substances so that people get the help they need, not jail time. We've got to commit to a democracy we can count on and where we all count. But none of this will happen unless we make it happen. I am calling on you, calling on folks across the Commonwealth and caucuses all over to ask for your support, to join with me as one Commonwealth. Let's reimagine the possible. Let's get it done. I'm Danielle Allen, running to be our next governor, and I'd be proud and honored to have you as a part of this big team of guts and grit and heart and hustle that we're building on behalf of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up to speak is Senator Sonia Diaz. Sonia is the daughter of a social worker and America's first Latino astronaut, Franklin Chang Diaz. She was elected to the Commonwealth's first Latina state senator in 2008 and quickly became a driving force behind many of the state's biggest progressive reforms, including landmark $1.5 billion progressive education funding reforms, criminal justice reform, LGBTQ equal rights, and police reform and accountability. Now, Sonia is running for governor of Massachusetts to continue the fight for bold, transformational change and build the future we all want our kids to grow up in.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thank you also, Shirley, and to all of you folks here in person in Littleton, and all of you watching from home. I'm not really sure where to live for the folks at home. And Danielle, it is good to be with you as always, especially
I apologize.
in person. Apologies. So I am Sonia Chang Diaz, and for those who don't know me, I am a mom. I am a former public school teacher, and as you heard, I am Massachusetts' first Latina and first Asian American state senator. And I'm running for governor because every day it gets harder and harder for families to live here in Massachusetts. We've got housing costs that are just going through the roof. We've got some of the worst traffic congestion in the nation and the fastest growing student debt load, healthcare costs, childcare costs going up and up and up. And hanging over all of that, the consequences of climate change are just barreling towards us. And the truth is, leaders on Beacon Hill have been telling working families to wait for too damn long for meaningful change on these problems. The fire that I bring to this race comes from my past. My dad came to this country as an immigrant from Costa Rica with $50 in his pocket. But with the help of teachers and lunch ladies and librarians along the way, he made it not only to college, but to space. And he became NASA's first Latino astronaut. My mom, as you heard, is a social worker and a woman of faith. She spent her career helping women and children on the margins of society. And each of them, in their own way, taught me about the incredible promise and opportunities of this country. And also how the only way that we're going to deliver on those things is to raise our voices together and stand up for our best values. And those lessons have stayed with me my entire life. Working as a public school teacher in one of the poorest and the least funded school districts in Massachusetts, Lynn. Every day in Lynn, I saw the way that the gap between have and have-not communities and Beacon Hill's willful inattention to that gap narrowed the life choices for my students. So I ran for office. And for 13 years, I've been fighting like hell, alongside many of you, for transformational change in our state. And in that time, I've seen firsthand that we've still got too many folks in our government who seem to be more concerned with holding on to power than doing something with it. And that is how it has gotten so hard to live and work and raise a family. I'm running for governor to change that. Because in those 13 years that I've been in office, I've stood with organizers and advocates and community leaders to win big for our families. $1.5 billion in progressive education aid for our schools, criminal justice reform, police accountability, LGBTQ rights, going all the way back to I remember Corey reform. We have shown through these wins, we don't have to accept the world as it's presented to us. And that's how I know that we can deliver debt-free, quality education to every kid in Massachusetts from birth into adulthood. We can pass the Green New Deal to win the fight against climate change and create tens of thousands of good paying jobs while we're at it. And we can close the racial wealth divide, rebuild the middle class, make it so that our young people's economic fortunes look better and not worse than their parents. You know, Massachusetts is a state that should be leading on all of these things. And not to mention those things, but also voting rights, health equity, greening our energy use, building a 21st century transit system. We've already shown that that future is possible. We just have to stand together. We got to see each other's fights as our own. And we got to elect a governor who does not just say the right words, but who's shown that she's willing to take action on tough fights, even when it's not politically convenient, in order to deliver the change that we need. My friends, no one is entitled to this office. And I'm not taking any voters for granted, right? That's why I'm out here working, organizing, listening to the change that families need in order to not just win back the corner office, but also to deliver the change once we get there. And I didn't get into this race because I thought it was going to be easy. I did not get into it because I saw a good career opportunity. I got into it because I have stood on the front lines with families across this state for my whole life. I know the urgency of the moment that we're living in, and I know the future that we can build together. So I'm looking forward to talking about all of those things with you today and answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So our first question is on the topic of protecting our democracy. All across the country, the right to vote has been under attack from right-wing efforts to suppress voter turnout. Recently, both chambers of the Massachusetts legislature have taken up election reform legislation. Do you believe the legislation taken up in Massachusetts goes far enough to guarantee the right to vote for all Massachusetts residents? And if not, what additional electoral reforms would you propose to ensure Massachusetts leads nationwide on this issue? We'll start with Danielle.
No, thank you so much. It was really wonderful to be with some of you in Concord on January 6th as we commemorated the terrible insurrection from the year earlier. And we all have felt just so much pain at what we've been watching in our democracy and what we've been watching as voting rights have been under attack. We have real work to do here in Massachusetts. It was great to see the Senate passed the Votes Act, so congratulations, Senator Diaz. And I regret that the House stripped same-day voter registration out of that. As governor, I will, if that doesn't get done this year, I will make that a top priority. I will also work to empower municipalities to adopt ranked choice voting. I believe that's also an important provision for everybody's voice to be heard.
So I want to zoom out here and thank you, Danielle. I appreciate the shout out to the Senate. And Dawn, I know it's sincere. And, you know, I was proud to vote for the Votes Act, including Election Day registration in the Senate. But my commitment to voting rights and election reform goes way, way back since, you know, I was a lead organizer before I was ever in office, serving as a board member of Mass Vote. And I got to give a shout out here to my good colleague and friend and good troublemaker, Jamie Eldridge, who has served for many years with me on the Mass Vote board. Very proud to count, you know, among ours. So, you know, working for years, laboring in the vineyards to get Election Day registration passed, to win some of the successful reforms of the past decade around automatic voter registration, online voter registration, pre-registration for 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds, fully bilingual ballots and transliterated ballots. These have been some of the victories. I also served as vice chair of the Senate Redistricting Committee in 2011 when we had just a banner round of redistricting. We increased by 50% the number of majority minority districts in the Senate and by 100% increase in the House during that round of redistricting. So lots of good work over the years, but no, we do need to go further. Like I said, Massachusetts should be leading on voting rights. Election Day registration, certainly we ought to be able to get that done here. I also proposed an amendment in the Senate version of the bill to strengthen jail-based voting and voting rights for returning citizens, because that is a place where we can and should be going further.
Danielle, any reply?
Happy to move on to the next question. I think we're in the very same pace on voting rights.
Just a brief from the Littleton Cable Access, to pull your mics a little bit closer, so we can definitely hear you.
All right.
Our next topic is transportation. Even before the pandemic, ridership across many of our region's MBTA stations have been falling for the better part of the past decade. Statewide, the pandemic has only further exacerbated this problem. What is your vision for the future of the MBTA? And what projects would you prioritize for public transportation as governor? Sonia, will ask you to speak first.
Yeah. So I am going to take a little liberty here and broaden this question beyond the MBTA, because of course that's exactly what we need to do with public transportation. Look, public transit is a public good. And we need to recognize it. It's a common good. And when we can get more people out of their cars, off of roads and onto public transit, it serves all of us, right? We need to marshal every person that we can into the fight to win against climate change and truly move to a carbon-free economy in Massachusetts. So that is going to involve absolutely shoring up the MBTA, clearing the state of good repair backlog, which is enormous, but also east-west rail, truly expanding and electrifying our commuter rail to make it into a regional rail system with reliable 15 to 30 minute service throughout the day, so that it becomes a truly viable option for commuters to use that system instead of their vehicles, their individual vehicles. And I've also made the commitment that in my first year in office, my first budget will include funding for fare-free buses, both in the MBTA and in our regional transit authorities.
Perfect. No, thank you. Well, I think on the question of transit and transportation, we have to start by just acknowledging that so many of us in the state suffer PTSD from the Big Dig. And truly, that has been one of the biggest hindrances to doing the work that we need to do to achieve rail Commonwealth-wide, to achieve full electrification of commuter rail, to invest in our MBTA system as we should properly, to build out our regional transit authorities as we need to do. So as governor, my number one job will be to restore ambition and purpose and strategic energy across DOT and MBTA as a part of that. And I do think one of the things we most importantly need to do there is actually to go ahead and reorganize so that we have a one Commonwealth rail division that actually is taking commuter rail out of MBTA, linking it up with rail under DOT so that we actually can fully embrace the full rail transformation vision that the strategic plan developed and was released in 2020. It takes a lot of resources to achieve this. It will take strong partnership with the federal government, but it will also take our internally doing the work of getting preliminary plans done, getting preliminary engineering done so that we have those plans ready to apply for the matching grants from the federal government. So at the end of the day, we do need to transition to full electrification. We do need fare, free transit in high density places that are serving working communities. But what we really need is will and purpose and to overcome the PTSD that we are still suffering from.
Further thoughts, Sonia?
I'll just add briefly, I underscore what Danielle said about the missing ingredient being political will, right? We are not limited in this Commonwealth by technology or know-how or public opinion in most issues. It really has been a shortage of political will and truth-telling from our current governor about the state of poor repair and what it's going to take to actually build a 21st century transit system. And just zooming out here and talking about the human stakes of this, I mentioned this is essential to us winning the fight against climate change, but getting transportation policy right is also so much about what, it is a key component to solving our housing crisis and to expanding economic opportunity all across our state, getting people out of these soul-crushing commutes and back to with their families and investing in their careers and their educations instead.
Stay with transportation. Currently, MassDOT is conducting a northern tier passenger rail study, which would provide east-west rail travel through our region, connecting Boston to North Adams. Do you support east-west rail in Massachusetts? And if a northern tier option is chosen, how will you ensure that investments are also made to improve the Fitchburg line as part of the project? Danielle?
So I started my work on this campaign with an exploratory period and a listening tour I ran around the Commonwealth. And my very first listening session was in the Hill Towns. And I heard from all the folks in that conversation just this real sense of abandonment and separation from the rest of the Commonwealth. And that then was sort of the theme for the rest of my listening tours. I traveled around the state, particularly in Western Massachusetts. The numbers of kinds of frustration that people have with not being a part of all the growth and activity and energy of Massachusetts as a whole. So my overarching commitment in this campaign is to being one Commonwealth. And so, yes, I do support the East-West rail vision. I think it is critical. It is critical to moving past our split screen economy where we have booming growth in the Boston area, but other parts of the state that have experienced real contraction in their economy. In terms of the Fitchburg piece in particular, that is a part that I would need to dig into and more, but I'm a big believer of building teams that have the capacity to set strategic direction, and the teams I build will start with a commitment to that one Commonwealth vision that I'm sharing.
So I think my answer to this will be brief. Yes, the answer is yes on East-West Rail. With respect to the exact placement, right, of where the East-West line goes, we do need to stay anchored in those first principles, right, of what is it that we are building this thing in order to accomplish. And that's the end. You have to name the end goal clearly so that you can shoot to it, with clarity and purpose and with discipline. And so first of all, let me say on process, making sure that we have a process for the selection of the route that is truly inclusive and not just pro forma is, that has been a through line of my work in the Senate over the past 13 years. I remember when I was serving on the Foundation Budget Review Commission to establish the recommendations for K-12 education funding reform. We committed to having 13 hearings around the state, even though that was well beyond what the law required. And we did them at night and on the weekends so that real people could participate in the process. And it showed up in the feedback and the participation at the hearings that we got. So I'm committed to that kind of process for a major infrastructure investment like East-West Rail. And then depending on where we select it, we need to make sure that there's going to be access, whether it's to the East-West Rail itself, right? Or how do we also enliven regional transportation systems so that we're not just getting people in and out of Boston, right, or Worcester or Springfield, but we're enlivening local economic opportunities as well.
Danielle, any reply?
Not so much a reply, just to add, as a nonprofit leader, I have spent my career convening people, bringing stakeholders together around tough problems, and always recognizing that you need so many different kinds of background and experience and expertise to get that work done. And I think one of the most important things we need to do in the Commonwealth is to support that kind of regional convening for all of our major systems, problems and challenges that we need to address. We have a lot of talent, a lot of capacity all over the Commonwealth, leadership solutions emerging out of towns and cities, but also where coordinating regionally would help us sharpen our solutions. So I am committed to that regional component as we address our transportation challenges.
Thank you. Next topic is taxation. Voters will be deciding whether to pass the Fair Share Amendment this fall. The legislature approved additional 4% tax on incomes over $1 million. Should the question pass, the generated revenue is to be allocated toward transportation and education improvements across the Commonwealth. That allocation is subject to appropriation, which means it would be incumbent upon you as governor and upon the legislature to determine what investments deserve priority. Do you support the Fair Share Amendment? And if the question is successful, what would some of your priorities be for allocating those funds? Sonia?
So first of all, Kathleen, I'm really glad that you guys included this question in the lineup, because it's important for us to know, and for you as voters to know, where the candidates stand and how we're going to get from A to B on some of these beautiful things that we're talking about on the campaign trail, right? So part of how we're going to get there on electrifying and expanding our commuter rail and building east-west rail and shoring, clearing our state of good repair backlog is through the Fair Share Amendment. And for that reason, I absolutely do support it, and I've been vociferous about that. And you'll always know where I stand. And I have also been a longtime supporter and filer of legislation to make our tax code more progressive here in Massachusetts. Because look, we got to pay for the things that we say we believe in, and walk the walk, not just talk the talk as a Commonwealth. So I absolutely support it. And in terms of how, what will we spend it on, right? I just mentioned about some of the transportation priorities, but universal quality early education and care is another major priority for my administration. And I anticipate some of the resources will go into that as well.
So as you all know, I'm a historian, so I always bring a historian's perspective to the questions of what we also are trying to do for the future. And so as I've been listening to the debates in the state about taxes and budget surplus and the like, I have just been powerfully struck by how wrong-headed, honestly, our current governor is with regard to the issue of revenue in the state. And what do I mean by that exactly? We had a similar moment at the end of World War II. The US had incredible budget surpluses. And like then, this is a time of existential crisis, existential challenge. The pandemic is a challenge at the same level as the impact of a war on a society. The 2008 recession is an impact of that scale. The things that we're dealing with regard to climate are impacts of that scale. After World War II, when the US had a budget surplus, we took those resources and we invested in the infrastructure of a free and prosperous Europe, because we knew that investing in that would be better for us in the long term. I believe we're in the same kind of moment here in Massachusetts. We have got to invest in the people of Massachusetts. We have got to invest in our shared prosperity. I do support the Fair Share Amendment wholeheartedly. I believe it is time for everybody to be committed to investing in the past prosperity of the people of Massachusetts. And the priorities that have been named, the transportation priorities and the universal access to high quality early education, are priorities I wholeheartedly agree with. As governor, I would move those priorities forward and would be always delighted to make the case about how we can invest in the people of Massachusetts to achieve our shared prosperity and our inclusive well-being.
Thank you, Sonia. Further thoughts? Great. Up next, environment and climate. While the state has committed to some ambitious climate action goals and strategies, the sense of urgency appears to be lacking to implement many of the statewide programs aimed at achieving those goals. How would you accelerate state-level climate action? What day one actions would you take to begin to get Massachusetts back on track toward meeting our emissions reduction targets? Danielle?
I know everybody here feels the power of the climate crisis. I have talked to way too many young people who have told me they are not going to have kids, all right, because they do not have confidence in our future as humanity. This is not acceptable. So the short of it is, we do have good frameworks in place at this point, legislative frameworks, but we need, again, the will for implementation. This requires putting in the driver's seat at DPU and for critical boards and commissions, people who are experts in renewable energy infrastructure, not folks who are interested in figuring out how to navigate a future for fossil fuel energy. We've got to change who's in the driver's seat. That's job number one. So as governor, when I came in, the very first thing I would do to accelerate this transition would be to make those appointments. And the second piece of that would be to make sure that those appointments are working toward designing a new energy infrastructure for us. That is really a fossil-free infrastructure, leapfrogs over what we have, addresses the challenge of getting us off gas infrastructure, dealing with interconnection issues around solar so that we can be as ambitious and aggressive on solar as we are currently being on wind energy. So those would be critical first steps I would take as governor.
So everywhere I go across the state over the past 7 months, whether it's been forums like this or backyard barbecues and the like when the weather was a little bit better, invariably there is usually a college student or a high school student who will be the one who will raise their hand and say and ask the tough question about climate. And are you going to go faster than the goals that the Commonwealth has already set? And I was proud to vote for the climate roadmap bill. It was an important step forward, but we do need to go faster, harder, and with greater urgency so that we don't hand to our children a planet on fire, which they are rightly fearful of. And this isn't some problem that's around the corner, right? It is upon us. We are already seeing record rainfall, record-setting temperatures right here in the Commonwealth. And we have some of the, the highest rates of public housing and affordable housing that are in floodplains here in Massachusetts in the whole country. So communities of color and low-income communities are going to get it worse. So I would do several things, right, in the immediate days first in office. One is, as Danielle has said, appoint people to the Secretariat of Energy and Environmental Affairs and to the Division of Public Utilities who give a damn about the work of climate change and making this transition to a clean energy economy. Also stopping giving ratepayer subsidies that you and I are all paying for the installation of new fossil fuel infrastructure that is going to last for at least another decade. There's so much more beyond that. I mentioned some of it in our, talk about transportation and getting people out of their cars, but those would be, first few days actions.
Thank you. Danielle, any other thoughts?
I should have also added, just so people are clear on my commitments, that while I think the legislative framework is good, what it does is provide a minimal standard for us, and we can exceed the ambitions in the roadmap. So I'm committed to 100% renewable energy economy and deep decarbonization by 2040. That means taking all of our systems forward together. That means it's about housing, retrofitting housing, it's about transportation we've been talking about, as well as being about the energy infrastructure that supports the whole of our economy.
Thank you. The climate crisis is larger than any one state and will require creative regional, national, and global approaches. Recently, the Transportation Climate Initiative collapsed, closing the door temporarily on a pathway toward regional climate collaboration. As governor, how would you work with our regional neighbors as well as our federal partners to maximize climate action here in Massachusetts? Sonia?
So let me first say, just because I know time is short, that we won't cover all the detail, that on my website, soniachankias.com, there is a full, fully built out Green New Deal plan that we've released. So I encourage folks to check it out for more detail. On this question, I think there's sort of two important parts to the answer. One is that absolutely the next governor does need to work as a coalition builder and a leader of states. But look, being a leader isn't just about charging ahead alone, right? Being a leader means doing that coalition building work so that we can transition our regional energy grid in collaboration with other states. But we cannot pin our hopes on other states and other countries in many cases, right? As we saw with the Canadian hydropower plan. So much of Governor Baker's plan to get us to green energy transmission rested on hydropower from Canada and the TCI that ultimately, those were in control of other states and countries. There is so much we can do here in Massachusetts that we have control over. It's not a good place for us to be as a state, to be at the end of a very long extension cord, right, that brings our energy in from other places. We have the natural resources. We are blessed in Massachusetts. Saudi Arabia of offshore wind here. We could fill all of our electricity needs with offshore wind alone, not to mention the prospects of solar and network geothermal. So there's a lot we can also do right here in Massachusetts to make this transition.
Thank you.
So I think we all, for all of again, these sort of big existential crises, we're all feeling a huge sense of frustration about the relationship between states and our federal government. We feel the kind of clunkiness of our system all the time. This is something we also experienced with COVID. As a national leader on COVID response, my team put out a plan for an interstate compact to drive testing infrastructure build-outs. We tried to get Governor Baker to lead on it. We failed to get Governor Baker to lead. We did get Governor Hogan to lead and build out that interstate compact for testing resources. That is a part of the infrastructure that now is finally getting to the delivery of testing for all of us. So I know what it means to work with regional partners, and we have to do the same thing here with regard to climate. Sonia's done a good job of describing a lot of the issues. I also believe we really need a regional collaboration that is working out a plan for next generation energy flow infrastructure. The point being that you need multimodal flow, multi-directional flow and the like. There are some good examples in other parts of the world of those collaborations. I would be driving that work.
Thank you. Additional thoughts, Sonia?
I'll just tag on that building winning coalitions to get things done that people thought were impossible at the beginning has been the story of my 13 years in the legislature. Back in 2015, 2016, when we first had the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission that became the seeds of the Student Opportunity Act, Beacon Hill pundits said that's pie in the sky. That'll never happen. The Baker-Polito administration dismissed it as unrealistic. But we pursued a 4-year dogged organizing campaign. And in 2019, because we had built an incredible coalition of families and students and everyone that signed us back across the state to get it done, in 2019, Governor Baker signed that bill into law in one of the poorest districts in schools in my district. And now it's the law, even though people said it wasn't possible. So building those kind of coalitions, whether it's for education or green energy transition, is what I know how to do.
Thank you. Like many communities across the Commonwealth, our region has been no stranger to PFAS contamination in our drinking water supply. Removing this forever chemical is an expensive process, especially for municipalities with already constrained local budgets. What role do you see the state playing in supporting municipalities with drinking water contaminants?
So this is an issue on which I will readily own that I'm going through a fast learning curve on. Some of my excellent colleagues in the Senate, I'll call out here Joe Comerford from Western Massachusetts, has been educating us all, and it's frightening, honestly, when what we are starting to learn about PFAS. So I don't pretend to have all of the solutions here, but what I will pull on, right, the sort of core concepts that I will pull on as a problem solver and a partner with local communities and families who are impacted by PFAS, which is probably all of us across the Commonwealth, is first of all something that I attribute again to my good friend Jamie Eldridge over here, who for many years has filed, I don't know if you're still filing it, Jamie, a polluter pays law that would require computer manufacturers to take back the hardware, right, that they are putting out into the system that could put so much pollution, right, into our landfills and our groundwater and the like. So that if you're putting the bad stuff out into the system, you need to be a part of the solution for cleaning it up. So I do think we need to figure out, who is it who is putting, who's causing this problem in the first place, and make sure that they are at the table for being a part of the solution, so that localities don't have to carry this weight alone, and that even the state and localities together as partners don't have to carry that weight alone.
Yeah.
As with the big picture problems around climate and the problems around COVID, I mean, this is another place where I think a lot of us feel a real sense of frustration. We can see a problem in our own community, in the water in our town, for instance, but we can also see that it's a Commonwealth-wide problem. And then we sort of see how people are stuck in terms of figuring out how those pieces fit together. I think some of the best work we're seeing in the Commonwealth right now is coming because people are collaborating at a regional level. So the Cape is really tackling PFAS in really powerful ways right now. And that is because the Cape has the Barnstable County Commission, which is able to take on water issues. The South Coast has a huge amount of water issues right now, but are struggling with not quite having the support for that regional effort. As governor, I will support our Commonwealth sort of working in regional ways to tackle these problems so we could more efficiently bring state resources to bear on the expense of getting PFAS out of our water system and out of our wells. I will also add, though, that of course, a heck of a lot of this is about the problem of waste. My climate agenda, you can find all of our agendas on our website as well at allenforma.com. It's a One Commonwealth Agenda platform, as we call it. But we are also making a zero waste, we're committed to the zero waste approach that we need to build here in Massachusetts. So really endorse the work of Representative Ciplo, for example, on that front, and think that's an important part too of getting past our problem of PFAS.
Thank you. Final thoughts, Sonia? Great. Switching topics to COVID-19 related issues. Local boards of health, school committees, school administrators, and select boards have had to deal with disruptive protests and threats as a result of the lack of guidance and leadership from the Baker-Polito administration around statewide health public policy. Describe the relationship you hope your administration will have with municipal officials, especially in times of crisis. Please explain how your background prepares you to build relationships with local leaders across the state who might have competing priorities. Start with you, Danielle.
Sure, no, thank you so much. I mean, really, COVID taught us so many things, and it taught us, as I'm always saying, that we needed more testing, but it also taught us that we live or die by our democracy. And, you know, we really watched as we had unnecessary death for working people, for older people, for communities of color. And so much of that was also about the fact that we didn't see good coordination between our state government and local officials. I spent a lot of time working with Cambridge School Committee, working hard to help support a return to safe and healthy in-person learning, safe for learners and educators and staff. My team built a framework, and what we were doing was stepping into a gap that state government had left, where every town and city was having to become its own epidemiologist, figure out all the basics of infection prevention and control. It's very clear that there's a role for state government to provide knowledge resources, to build communities of practice that permit knowing what best practices are, while still empowering local school committees to make those decisions. That is the work that I did do in COVID, and it is exactly the same perspective and approach I would bring as governor.
Sonia?
Can you take the question on?
Absolutely. Describe the relationship you hope your administration would have with municipal officials, especially in times of crisis. Please explain how your background prepares you to build relationships with local leaders across the state who might have competing priorities.
Thank you. There's just so much to say about COVID that I wanted to focus on the actual question. You know, this administration's approach to COVID, I think, has pretty consistently been every person, every municipality, or every business for his or her or itself. We saw that, I think, most starkly in the vaccine rollout about a year ago. When it was sort of, it was the Hunger Games, right, of trying to find an appointment for a vaccination. And the sort of theory of action for the state government was, well, we're going to put all the vaccines in a pile over here, and if you want to go, get them. And it was with very little to no thinking about what were all of the structural barriers that might block a person from being able to, be an agent of their own salvation in that case. We need a government, we need a state government and an executive branch that is going to be a true partner with families, individuals, businesses, and municipalities, and not just stand at a podium and say, stay safe, everybody, keep those schools open for 180 days, everybody, and then walk away. We need a partner in our state government that is going to, A, look down the road and around the corner and be able to anticipate the things that are foreseeable, that are predicted and that have been predicted throughout this pandemic. Like in the past few months, it's totally knowable that we were going to see a spike in transmission and demand for testing and for PPE. We could have been ahead of the curve on that one. So we need that from our state leadership. We need to focus on equity every step of the way. I think the thing that prepares me best for this, and I'll say in like 10 seconds, is my 8 years of service as chair of the Education Committee in the legislature, which took me into circulation with school districts of every size and type across this Commonwealth in order to make policy that worked for the whole.
Thank you. Danielle, other thoughts?
I do just want to add appreciation for the question. It's a really important question. And for me, the job of the governor has 3 lanes. There's the lane of working with the legislature. There's the lane of driving state agencies so you can develop cultures of innovation and inclusion and transformation. And then there is the lane of coordinating with towns and cities across our Commonwealth. From my point of view, all 3 lanes are equally important. as somebody who has been a nonprofit leader for the last 20 years, I have worked in that space of coordinating across civic stakeholders consistently. That's the lane I have my deepest body of experience in. I absolutely acknowledge that Senator Diaz has a deep body of experience in the legislative lane, for example. We all bring a different kind of experience to the table. So it really will be for the people of Massachusetts to choose which is the right experience set to meet the moment.
Thank you. The COVID-19 pandemic has placed significant hardship on many of our Commonwealth's small businesses. What would you say to a small business owner who is watching, who is worried about what next year might look like for them? What types of support can they expect should your administration take office next January? Sonia?
So I think I'll link back to my previous answer here about we need to have a state executive that sees it as a part of their responsibility and role to walk as a partner truly with businesses in this case. And I'll give another specific example here. There were many states that were way ahead of Massachusetts in rolling out a vaccine credential system. We could have done that months ago. In fact, we had the technology months ago ready to go in Massachusetts. And the governor delayed and delayed and delayed in releasing it until basically, tons of cities and towns and businesses had already just said, look, we've got to figure this out for ourselves and, invent their own, reinvent the wheel 100 times over across, probably more than 100 times over across so many different businesses for how they were going to do vaccine credentialing system for their employees or in some cases for their clientele. It doesn't have to be that way. We could have had a more proactive response from the government. In terms of looking ahead to next year, look, we all know that we cannot anticipate everything about this pandemic, but we again need to work on the things that we can anticipate and work on them before they, flare up into crises and address them before those crises arise. One of the, as I said before, one of the first things and highest priorities that I will have in my administration is to create a truly universal early education system in Massachusetts, because we've seen in this pandemic that our economy rests on a very fragile, rickety early education system. And businesses are suffering from it because their workforce cannot get back to work. Well, we've got rolling blackouts in our schools because there's not enough staffing and the like. Probably many of you in this room have experienced it as parents or as business owners.
Danielle?
I think it was the middle of December, maybe December 15th, I had my last dinner at my favorite local restaurant around the corner from where I live because they didn't make it. They reinvented themselves a couple times through the course of the pandemic, and then they just couldn't make another reinvention as Omicron was hitting. And I know we all know people that we care about who've been trying to figure out how to make things work in this period and have just watched what small businesses have experienced. So for starters, we just have to acknowledge the pain and depth of the impact. But the fact is, small businesses have had a lot of challenges in Massachusetts for a long time, even before the pandemic. One of the hardest ones is supporting health insurance for employees. It's a real sort of piece of the burden that small businesses carry that makes it hard for them to actually kind of get the lift off that they need. So in our health agenda, our health equity agenda, we are proposing building a public-private partnership to support insurance for employees of small businesses. This would be transformative for what's possible for small businesses in our state. So I invite you to take a look at our health agenda on our website to learn more about that. But I do hope that this is something that people will see as of immense importance so that we can really improve the economic opportunity across our state for people trying to build small businesses.
Thank you. Sonia, further thoughts?
I'll tack on one more thing. I can't resist. One of the favorite things, one of my favorite line items in the state budget that I have gone to bat for many years is called the Small Business Technical Assistance. It's a boring name for something that works really well. It is, and on a relatively small dollars, it has been a huge lever for accessing greater private capital for micro businesses, very local businesses in our communities across the state, particularly in low-income communities, communities of color, immigrant communities that have, of course, been hardest hit by the pandemic. So this is something we can do in the immediate term while we're working on standing up universal early education, is put a significant increase into that small business TA line item so that we're giving a direct line of infusion and help in the immediate term to our smallest and most needful businesses so that they can stay open.
Thank you. You've both called for universal healthcare access in your platforms, but you differ on some of the specific policy pathways to get there. Please explain briefly your plan to ensure universally accessible and affordable healthcare for all residents of Massachusetts. How would you implement your plan? Start with you, Danielle.
Thank you. Again, I mean, this is another area where we all have such a powerful sense of what it means when people don't have access to good health coverage, or where people get trapped as they're trying to move between jobs with trying to deal with changing providers and the like. And at the end of the day, my health agenda is based on the very basic principle that health should be universal, simple, and affordable. And there are really two parts to our work. We believe everybody deserves an access to the health foundations. So housing security, food security. A lot of the work in our agenda is around housing, because that is actually a key part of getting people to a place where they can live healthy lives in the first place. And then we also need a healthcare system where everybody's got that universal, simple access to high quality healthcare. But remember, healthcare is what we do when things go wrong. So we've got to be working on making sure that health goes right for people too in the first place. So on the health goes right part, we're putting resources into our community health centers, public health infrastructure, so that primary preventive care and a backbone for that is strengthened for all communities in the Commonwealth. We're working to close the coverage gap, the last 3% who are uncovered, by building out parts of the public program, Mass Health, to fold in people who are undocumented, also closing the SNAP gap. And then, as I said, working to bring care into communities through that investment in community health centers and the like, in order to get to that place where healthcare access is simple, as well as being affordable and universal. I mentioned the small business piece as well. There are other parts to the agenda, but I hope that gives you a first picture of what we're working on.
Thank you, Sonia.
So my grandfather, may he rest in peace, was a lifelong small government Republican. He was also a rural doctor in Montana. For many years, probably even decades, he was the only doctor around for miles and miles, like delivered every baby, performed wild, crazy surgeries. And I asked him once with some trepidation, Grandpa, what do you think we need to do to fix our healthcare system? And he said, I thought about it, I've looked at it, and I don't see how we get the greed out of healthcare where it doesn't belong, other than with a single payer system. And if that's good enough for my Republican grandpa, but there is hope for us here in Massachusetts, right? I think we've got the makings of a win. We've got a winning case here. We have a lot of work to do politically in order to make the case to our fellow Bay Staters, although the movement is growing. And so we have to keep the press on to get to that ultimate stage, because we are spending an obscene amount of money on the bureaucracy of insurance and billing, processing, paperwork. And so many other countries around the world have figured out how to do this, how to deliver way better health outcomes with much less cost. So ultimately, that's where we need to be pushing to. In the meantime, right, while we were working to get there, there are things that we need to do, right away for people who don't have access to healthcare realistically now, right? This is all of the social determinants of health, right? Housing, environmental justice, food security, community health centers, making sure that our community hospitals survive and we don't just all get gobbled up by these, large mega hospitals that have higher costs. And then I will just say a quick touch here that our workforce is so important here, particularly in mental and behavioral health, where we have just a massive workforce shortage. So I'm going to tie this back to my proposal for debt-free access to public higher ed, so that we can get more people into the workforce and they can stay there and not have to get buried under the student debt load.
Thank you, Danielle. Additional thoughts?
Thank you. So let me come back again to the basic principle. The goal is universal, simple, and affordable healthcare. And in principle, you can have that through any of the structures that exist around the world. Single payer, hybrid, public-private, or sort of all-payer system like Maryland. The question we have in Massachusetts is, how do we get to universal, simple, and affordable from where we are? What's the best way, the most successful way to get there? I believe the best way to get there at this point is to see the existing public backbone that we have in our community health centers, our public health infrastructure, our capacity to tighten that connection to schools, build nodes of health in schools with more health personnel in schools, invest in that public backbone of provision of primary preventive care, improve the insurance system by closing the coverage gaps for undocumented people and small businesses, and then also make sure that we're not relying on our high-cost hospitals for provision of routine things, and use reference pricing to get costs under control.
Thank you. Housing. Many communities in our region have not met their Chapter 40B requirements to designate at least 10% of their housing stock as affordable. How would you address the oftentimes competing yet potentially complementary goals of promoting new housing in our small rural communities that is cost-effective and accessible, while also growing the amount of conserved public lands that can help mitigate the more extreme flooding and heat risk events our region is already experiencing? Start with you, Sonia.
So look, I don't think that I have been literally to a single municipality across the state, city or town, in the past 7 months on the campaign trail, where people don't talk to me in pretty extreme terms about their deep anxiety around the issue of housing and our housing shortage. It's a crisis in our state. We've got young people that cannot afford to put down roots in the communities that they grew up in, elders who are getting pushed out of the communities that they've built up, municipal workers, police, firefighters, teachers who can't afford to live in the communities that they serve. So we have got to get our hands around this problem. And I think the answer, to the question about balancing, land use is, particularly centered around transit-oriented development, right, and smart growth. And as we go expanding our transit system, right, as we've talked about earlier today, making sure that that comes with tools and requirements for localities to do zoning around those transportation nodes and those downtown centers for more affordable housing in places where it is going to make the most difference, where people can access, commercial centers and rapid transit. Secondly, we just straight up need to increase more supply. It has to be done, in a concerted and a thoughtful way. But we need more reliable and larger funding streams to assist with this, creating that more supply of affordable housing. And that's why I so actively support the HERO Act, which would increase the Deeds excise transfer tax on housing and split that revenue between affordable housing and climate mitigation. To anchor back to your question about how do we do both, feed those two birds with one hand.
Danielle?
So I mentioned that when I started this, I started with a listening tour all around the Commonwealth. And like Sonia, everywhere I've been, so for me, in my case, working for a year, talking to people, housing has been the most intense pain point. I knew housing was an issue in the Commonwealth when I started, and by May, I understood it was the single most pressing issue everywhere. People are living in the woods in Western Massachusetts. Working people are getting up in tents in the morning on Martha's Vineyard and going to work. It's not just the tent encampments at Mass and Cass, for example, it is our whole Commonwealth. And we have to meet this with a Commonwealth-wide commitment, a moral commitment to a roof over every head. We have to actually take that moral commitment into our spirits and mean it. But the other thing we have to do is to lift up the problem and really see it as a shared problem across the Commonwealth. We have been asking every town and city to work on this separately. This is sort of like putting everybody in a context where nobody can actually solve the problem for themselves. Produces all kinds of fights inside of communities, and exactly the kind of fight you were describing, Kathleen, where it seems like there's a conflict between building more housing and preserving the lands we need for a healthy, sustainable climate that gives everybody access to that basic foundation of health we were just talking about. We can actually solve this problem by lifting it up, looking at it Commonwealth-wide, having a Commonwealth-wide strategic plan around affordable housing. It is about supply, it is about zoning reform, needing to do work on that Commonwealth-wide. It is also, though, about building decision contexts where people can put values together. Save Twin Brooks on the Cape is a great organization that has finally brought affordable housing activists and preservationists together to answer the question, so how can we align our values, not consider them as being in trade-off with each other? And that's the work we need to do Commonwealth-wide.
Any additional thoughts?
I'm just going to go one further here and say that we can solve another problem if we do this right, we do the planning right. Where we are expanding housing because transportation is serving those areas as well. We also need to get serious about rooftop solar so that we can be doing rooftop solar in those places where we're already building buildings, right? So that we're also not sort of, in a similar way, cannibalizing our green spaces where we don't need to serve our energy needs.
Thank you. While additional tenant protections existed during the pandemic to try to keep Massachusetts residents housed, many of those protections have expired. In a recent local case, dozens of families in the Devon's Crest neighborhood of Air, some of whom lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years, were given notices of intent to evict. Reporting throughout the pandemic has documented how seniors, low-income residents, and as well as Black and Latino residents disproportionately make up those being evicted. As governor, what, if any, additional tenant protections would you advocate for and work with the legislature to get on the books? As housing costs continue to skyrocket, how can we ensure housing stability for the most vulnerable to eviction? Start with you, Danielle.
The reason I jumped into all the COVID response work that I did was because the impacts of the pandemic were so different for different communities. Working communities, communities of color, just found themselves exposed to a degree of risk and vulnerability that was completely unlike what, folks in my universe inside, for example, the university were experiencing, where people could just sort of write it out on Zoom. And we've had clarity about a split screen reality in our world for a long time, but I just feel like the pandemic brought an X-ray to that. And we just, again, have a moral responsibility to step up and respond to that. So I have been testifying before the legislature in support of the right to counsel in cases of eviction. I think we need that for tenants. I think we need to be able to empower municipalities to reintroduce rent stabilization. I also think we need to stabilize our rental arrearages program. It was taken out by the governor's office and then restored recently, grew in the context of the pandemic thanks to federal relief funds. And we need to ensure that we have a rental arrearages program that helps people stay in their house when they're between jobs and they're in a moment of transition, so that kids can study because they know that their place of abode is safe and secure, so that people can hold a job down because they're not in between places and now transport doesn't work for getting back to the job. So right to counsel rather, in cases of eviction, empowering municipalities to bring in rent stabilization and stabilizing our rental arrearages program. Those would be critical things as governor I'll work on.
Thank you. Sonia?
So also have been and will continue to be a supporter of right to counsel for evictions and housing cases, and have been a long time, and I'll lean on Jamie here again, developed for me on this one, as he has been a champ on fighting in the budget every year for rental assistance programs, whether through MRVP or RAF programs. But one thing that we have not yet mentioned that I think is really worth lifting up here is the TOPA Act, which is an option for tenants to purchase a building, such as one you described in the question, if it's coming off of a subsidy program. The renters can band together, or they can designate their rights to a municipality or to a nonprofit, a CDC, if you will, to have the right of first refusal to buy that property to keep it affordable. Even though the expiring use, protections may go away. So that's something I wholeheartedly support and will fight for. We also need to remove the prohibition at the state level on rental stabilization policies, so that cities and towns that know that this is the right solution for them locally can have that tool in their toolbox to put a cap, often anchored to the cost of living index on rent increases in their community. And then lastly, I'll say land trust is another really creative solution that I've seen work in my district in Boston that I think we need to do more of across the state. Once we get people stabilized, whether in rental housing, we need to be ready and willing to take the next step to grow home ownership. This is the root of so much of our racial wealth divide in Massachusetts. So we can't be satisfied with just stabilizing people with rents. We need to get also home ownership on the books.
And no additional thoughts?
I would endorse that. Absolutely. We need to increase our investments in first generation homeowners for sure. And right of first refusal is also a really important policy tool. Absolutely.
Switching topics, we're on our last topic of education. We have heard many refer to the need to reimagine public education as we come out of the pandemic. What are some of the lessons learned from education during the pandemic, and where do you see opportunities for real change? Start with Sonia.
Okay, should give you the layup with Reimagine on that. So much to say about education. Honestly, the things that we have learned most starkly about education, it shouldn't have taken us the pandemic to learn. There are new lessons to be had here for sure. But what we have seen, I think, most clearly in the pandemic is how critical education is to the health and well-being of our children, and how much we miss it when we don't have it. And B, how differential the experience is of how much the quality and the quantity of education that children are getting in Massachusetts still depends too much on the color of their skin and the zip code they live in or what's in their parents' wallets. And that has been true for generations, right? It did not start with this pandemic. And sadly, that differential will not end with this pandemic. So continuing to double and triple down on our commitment to implement the Student Opportunity Act, which is going to be a game changer. Passed into law in 2019, going to infuse $1.5 billion in new money into our schools, progressively targeted to districts of highest need. But it's not just going to happen, on autopilot because we put it in the law. I wish it were so. But we have to implement it with fidelity, as this governor has not been great at doing so far. And then we need to go hard at early education and debt-free higher education access at our public colleges and universities and community colleges in Massachusetts to make sure that education is not the province of the wealthy and the privileged on both ends of the spectrum.
Thank you, Danielle.
This is such an important question. I've got a 6th grader and a 4th grader, and I watched both of them just honestly suffer quite immensely through the course of the pandemic. My 4th grader, 2nd grade, they noticed watched his academic engagement decline precipitously, and that was in a family where we had a babysitter to help out all the time. And my poor 6th grader had a lot of mental health impacts from it. So first of all, I just want to register how hard it's been for families around the Commonwealth, but we have so much work to do. There's a lot to say for me. I'll just name 3 critical things right now. I share the commitment to universal access to high quality early education, 0 to 5, and again, support the Fair Share Amendment for that purpose. I also think it's time, as I mentioned earlier, to really work on building out our health resources in schools, and in particular, our behavioral and mental health resources. That's also connected with removing school resource officers and really bringing a health perspective and restorative justice perspective to the experiences of challenge that young people have. And then the 3rd thing I will say is that it really is time for us to unite equity and excellence in our educational system here in Massachusetts. We're so used to thinking we've got the best schools in the country, but as you all know, we just have extraordinary disparities. There is no excuse for defining excellence without incorporating equity in that definition. And I believe it's time for us in this state to have a new commission on the future of education. We haven't had one since Governor Weld. That brought in the approach to accountability that depends on standardization. We don't need that. Educational research has moved beyond that. We can have accountability with personalized approaches to learning, supporting multiple pathways to success. And I believe it's time for us to have a commission to deliver the strategic plan to achieve that.
Final thoughts, Sonia?
Yeah, so I think that, on education, as with so many issues, and I really mean it across issue areas in this election, it is so important. And you guys have a tough job here, right? You're going to have to listen hard and evaluate as you listen to the candidates. Not just, what are the ideas that we're putting on the table, but what is it going to take to get those things done? And getting more resources to, into our schools to change the status quo is not going to be easy. It was not easy to get the Student Opportunity Act passed. It is going to require having difficult conversations with people in charge on Beacon Hill, sometimes within our own party. And that is the work that I have been willing to do and have done in coalition with working families for years. And that's why now that as I'm across the state, I've talked to school leaders in different communities about how are they spending their first Student Opportunity Act dollars as they get them through the pipes this year. To a T, every one of them has said social emotional wraparound services is what they're spending those first dollars on. So the question is not just what should we do, but how are we going to get it? How are we going to get there? And that is the record that I bring to this race.
Thank you. Last question. Many of the school districts in our area are regionalized, many as a result of the state's promise of financial flexibility resulting from full reimbursement for regional transportation costs. The state has never met its promise to fully fund this cost. Simultaneously, transportation costs are rising because of school bus companies' monopoly power. As governor, how would you seek to address this issue? Seeing as the state legislature recently took up major education reform legislation, how would you work with those on Beacon Hill to move swiftly to address this and other urgent education funding issues? Danielle?
Thanks a lot. This is another issue I've heard a lot about as I've traveled around the state in Western Massachusetts, as well as in your own community. Unmet promises are unacceptable, and that's the first principle that we have to state. I've also actually honestly heard legislators report on all kinds of pieces of law that have been passed that the governor hasn't implemented. So one of the first things I would be doing would be asking really the legislature for a comprehensive list of what those unmet promises are. We've got to get our house in order and get those promises fulfilled. But what does that mean from the point of view of financing and funding? I do think that we have some flexibility and tools for addressing the problems of where regionalization has not been supported by finance. And I think some of the flexibility relates to how the pilot program operates in the state, payment in lieu of taxes, which we have not been fully enforcing or fully making use of the resources from that. And I think there's actually also some flexibility that we have around corporate property tax that could be actually adjusted in ways that would permit some Commonwealth-wide uses and could help us address some of the imbalances between rural and urban parts of the state. There's lots more to be said. That was a bit wonky. I apologize. The key point is just that unmet promises are unacceptable. And so we have a job to fulfill to clarify those and make sure we meet those promises.
Thank you, Sonia.
So the school transportation market, man, what an area in need of overhaul. This is something that I hear from districts of varying sizes and shapes, suburban, rural, declining enrollment, growing enrollment. We've got some real sort of not quite monopoly, but maybe near oligopoly type characteristics in the market, and it is just an awful pain point for districts. But I get it, I see it. In many cases, for some districts, your transportation costs exceed your classroom costs. So we do have to get our hands around this problem. There is and I will confess I have some cynicism about the word commission. But this one I actually think is one that we really do need the recommendations from. There is a transportation cost reform commission that was created in the Student Opportunity Act to give us recommendations about what we need to do to get our hands around this problem. So we're really looking forward to the recommendations from that commission. Here again, like the question was, what would you do to seek change on this? I think, and I'm not, just going to seek change a year from now in office. These are changes that I have been seeking and delivering on for years. It was not by accident that the precursor-led bill that led to the Student Opportunity Act was called the Promise Act, because we have made promises for so long to our students and our districts that the state has walked away from. And it makes smoke come out of my ears, honestly, when we do that. So keeping promises is what I have been about, and forcing the state to do just that for the last several years. And I will continue to keep that press on as governor.
Thank you. Danielle, final thoughts?
Good things.
This concludes the question and answer period of the forum. As Danielle gave introductory remarks first, Sonia will give her closing remarks first. Sonia?
So that went fast, an hour and a half. It's easy to burn an hour and a half when you're talking about policy with good folks. So look, we have talked about a lot of big issues that are facing our state and that we need to tackle, and about the changes that we need to deliver in order to make sure that Massachusetts works for all of its families. And I'm not going to lie to you guys, the work to deliver on this change is not always going to be easy. But I know that transformational change, like the ones we've talked about today, are possible because I've lived it. You can see it in the coalition of urban and suburban parents and students and workers and business leaders and researchers that we brought together to get the Student Opportunity Act passed. You can see it in the outside-in organizing that made true criminal justice reform possible in 2018, and in the police accountability law that protesters called us to in 2020. You can see it in the historic transgender equal rights law that we passed in Massachusetts in 2016 when states across the country were going in the opposite direction. The problem is, wins like those are still the exception rather than the rule. And I don't know about you guys, but I am tired of it being the exception. We got to make audacity the rule. We are a state with more millionaires than 46 other states. We for damn sure can pass the millionaire's tax here, you guys. We can get it done. And we can make universal early education and debt-free access to public higher ed a reality in this state. We can, like I said, we can make Massachusetts a leader in voting rights and greening our energy use and building that east-west rail and a 21st century transit system. These are things that are possible. They are within reach, closing the racial wealth divide, rebuilding the middle class, making it so that Danielle's kids and my kids and your kids have a better economic outlook than our parents did. This world is within reach. Don't let anyone tell you that it isn't. As we move forward through this pandemic, and as we are in this election cycle, we have a choice. We can go back to the status quo, or we can run towards problems with the urgency and determination to solve them. If that is the kind of future that you want to grab with both hands, and one that is worth rolling up your sleeves and fighting for, I'm asking you to join me. Join us, to caucus with us over the coming weeks, and to organize in the months ahead to win back the governor's office and to deliver the change that we need once we get there. I'm excited about building this future with you guys and partnering with you on this growing campaign. Sign up to join us at soniachangdiaz.com, and let's go get that future together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for excellent moderation, and Sonia for a fantastic conversation. It's really been a pleasure. And I just want to share, I got into this race, I got started exploring in the fall of 2020 because I didn't have confidence that anybody else would give voice to some of the things I think are most important. This week, I stood up on the Common and announced a commitment to reclassify, decriminalize substance use disorder issues and simple use of possession for controlled substances so that we can get help to people instead of handcuffs. That commitment in the justice space is what got me into this race, again, because I didn't have confidence that anybody else would speak up for those commitments. And I wanted to make sure that they were given voice too. I worked hard on an exploratory process, listening and learning, because I'm building agendas from the ground up, from the question of what the concerns and top priorities of the people of Massachusetts are. I launched formally in June saying that status quo is not an option. And boy, was I pleased in early December when the governor and lieutenant governor agreed. They said, that's right, status quo is not an option and we are stepping aside. So we should all just first of all pause and take pleasure in the extraordinary fact that we get to have a full debate about our dreams and desires, what we can imagine for the future of Massachusetts. And I really want to celebrate all of you for making that kind of real debate and discussion possible. That is the work we should be doing to chart a course into the future for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So just a round of applause, if you don't mind, for all of you. And it is also such a pleasure and honor to be a part of the field of candidates that are going to yield the first woman elected as governor of Massachusetts. A part of the most diverse field of gubernatorial candidates the Commonwealth has ever seen. It is a true honor and pleasure. We are three very different kind of candidates, as you can tell. We bring very different kinds of experience and backgrounds. My colleague brings a very distinguished legislative career. Our other colleague brings a distinguished career as the state's top law enforcement officer. I bring a distinguished career of 20 years of leadership and executive experience in the nonprofit sector, connecting the dots across the policy domains of health and education and the economy. So the people of Massachusetts are going to have to choose which set of skills most meets the moment, which set of skills best translates into executive office. The other thing I would leave you with is simply this. In this moment, again, COVID didn't just teach us that we need more testing. It taught us that we live or die by our democracy. We have a big job to do here in Massachusetts to show the pathway out of this dark, hard time to the green and healthy next generation democracy we all deserve. The whole country needs us to do this. We are a leadership state. We have Trumpism in our state, but we can turn the tide on it here in this state and show the path out. If we can do that, we can show the rest of the country what is necessary to turn the tide on the moment that we're living in. We are a leadership state. We have such a distinguished history of leadership. I am calling you to join with me on that big team of guts and grit and heart and hustle so that we can show the way for the rest of the country out of this dark and hard time. Thank you very much.
Before I close with a few thank yous, I'd like to invite Janine Wood, who's the chair of the Littleton DTC, to the front of the room, as she has a small token of our appreciation to the candidates for taking time out of their very busy schedules here today. Janine?
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you so much to both of the candidates here this evening. So these plants in front of you have a story. While President Barack Obama was in the White House, there was a beautiful Swedish ivy in the Oval Office on the mantelpiece, and it became a habit to give a clipping of that plant to people who visited his Oval Office. These plants are a cutting of a cutting of a cutting, but they originated in the Oval Office in the White House of President Barack Obama, and we would like each of you to have this plant. Your service. We thank you for running. What you are doing is hard, and we appreciate that, but we hope the plants bring you hope and joy and happiness, and thank you for being servants to us. I appreciate you.
Sort of ogling these the whole forum, so I'm really delighted I get to take one home. So thank you.
So in closing, I'd like to thank our steering committee, in particular Carrie Ayers of Lunenburg, who is our timer today, Dennis Bradley of Harvard, who coordinated our volunteers, Janine Wood of Littleton, who handled registration logistics, RSVPs, connected us to Littleton Cable Access, and coordinated with the library staff. And a special thank you to Dina Samfield, who had the idea for this event, handled outreach and publicity, and drove the process from start to finish. Our volunteers, Tenny Komar, Christine Brown, Stella Coe, Helen Bailey, Rafi Glad, Ellen Valdez, and a special thank you to Zach Gavel, who reviewed the flood of questions we received, organized them into categories, and then shaped them to cover as many topics and questions as we fit today. More about the candidates, you can find Professor Allen online at allen4ma.com and Senator Chang Diaz at soniachangdiaz.com. The primary will be held in September, the exact date to be finalized by the state legislature. The general election will be held on Tuesday, November 8th. Check the Secretary of State's website for the primary date, mark your calendar, and make a plan to vote. Thank you to everyone who joined us in person and online today, and thank you to the candidates for a terrific issues-based discussion. See you at the polls.